Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Narek, and I'm the Chief Communications Officer here at AUA. And we have the privilege of hosting this wonderful, now friend, I guess, virtual friend. We've never met in person. But Will has just been so nice to accept our invitation to be our guest speaker today. And we're honored that the AUA Media Lab could host events of this caliber that seeks to promote media literacy and education in Armenia. So today's session is brought to you by Will Potter, and an award-winning investigative journalist whose work focuses on social justice and environmental movements, as well as attack on civil rights post 9/11. Thank you, Will, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us today and you share your experiences and insights on this important topic. So today's event is going to be, we're going to give the floor to our invited guest. He's going to give his talk for 25-30 minutes. Then Sean, the program chair of the MAMJ program, will do a couple of questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. So without further ado, Will, the floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you so much to Narek and Sean and everyone at the University of Armenia for inviting me. And I appreciate you all taking the time. I know many of you are working full-time and then going to night classes in the evening, and others are full-time journalists already working. So I'm really grateful for you taking the time and fitting this into your schedule to talk about this, because I think we're at a critical point in many countries around the world where attacks on press freedom are escalating, and the work that you're doing right now is more important than ever. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how I approach my work as an investigative journalist, and particularly how I use the techniques of storytelling and even some fiction and cinema techniques to incorporate into my work. And I started thinking in this way because, frankly, my focus on counterterrorism, national security, surveillance, these are such abstract, huge topics. And I found it difficult to connect with my readers and the public to really bring these issues to life about the severity of what's taking place. So I started thinking in terms of storytelling and making these not just a work of investigative journalism, but also telling the story in a way that's going to resonate with your audience. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Did that work okay? Yep. So as a little bit of background, I'm first going to talk about my recent investigation. I spent 10 years investigating industrial agriculture. And I don't know about you all, but I grew up in Texas, and this is the story I was told of what a farm looks like. You know, it's the happy pigs and happy animals, the happy farmers, the small family farm. And what I realized is that in the last 50 years in the United States and around the world, there's been a shift to an industrial system. And the only reason we've been able to see what these new facilities look like is through the work of journalists and undercover investigators. And this became on my radar as someone focused on counterterrorism because these types of individuals were being labeled as terrorists by the US government and by corporations. They haven't done anything like threaten someone or cause violence or even property destruction. They're just taking photographs and documenting, but that was still being labeled as terrorism by the government. And part of that explanation was that these people were exposing really horrific cruelty. And they were also exposing public health and public safety violations that were putting consumers at risk. This was a really important story in the United States as this was developing. Of an investigator showed cows too sick to even walk were being pushed into the slaughterhouse with bulldozers and heavy equipment. And this is a risk to public safety, and it led to the largest meat recall in US history because those sick animals would have been fed to children in American schools as part of the National School Lunch Program. So I say all of this because it shows the importance of journalism, the importance of these investigations, but also why powerful people wanted to stop them. And in my work, I started seeing evidence of this was from an FBI file, the Federal Bureau of Investigation labeling journalists and investigators as a terrorism threat for doing things like videotaping the conditions of animals, as you see on the screen. Um, I also used open records laws to file for materials from the government that showed that the FBI and others are training FBI agents to view anyone who uses media as a potential terrorist threat. So that I know that's kind of a long background to this investigation because there's lots of moving pieces here. But the reason it started to get me to think about storytelling was I started seeing these new laws being passed around the country that label it as terrorism and make it illegal for journalists to take photographs of what happens on these industrial farms. And so, as an investigative reporter, I wanted to find other ways of telling this story. So, I started to use aerial photography and drones, and it was successful. You can see here, I'm starting to see the scale of these operations, the environmental impact and pollution. These big pits here are all waste that are just sit in open air facilities, and they affect the air quality, the water quality. Um, but as you all might know, when you're working on a story for so long, it can start to feel like you're not quite sure what that story is anymore. And that's how I started to feel. I was seeing journalism criminalized around the world. These laws have also spread to Australia, to Canada. They've been introduced different places throughout Europe. And so I'm seeing these attacks on journalism, and it really wasn't being discussed anywhere. Um, and despite all of these investigations, we were still really talking about these farms in the press as if they were kind of these old fashioned images we have. And at the time, I was a visiting professor at the University of Michigan, and the focus of my work was teaching storytelling techniques to academics, students, professors, doctors, business majors, because the university understood that all of these different disciplines need to understand how to communicate effectively in their work. I was also doing research on narrative psychology, how we make sense of the world as human beings through stories. I was talking to psychologists and others and scientists about how storytelling is actually part of how we've evolved as human beings. And I say all of this because at the time I was going back and forth to the university by motorcycle on country roads in Michigan. And every day I was passing these little red barns, these images of the farm. And it never registered to me that this is the story that we are all being deceived by. Now, the reality of modern farming is quite different. It's not these cute little red barns and family farms, it's an industrial system. And I argue in my book that the reason that the public and the government are often not seeing these facilities is because we're trapped in the story that we've been told since childhood of what a farm looks like. Now, I wanted to share that because I think it's a good example of how, um, even when we are fully immersed in an investigation, even when we are becoming experts on a topic, we can still miss the story that's in front of us. And I share that because I think we need to remember that we as humans um, are storytelling animals. We, oops, I did the wrong one here. Um, let's try this one more time. we make sense of the world through stories. And I would argue that we're really the only species on the planet that does this. Other species feel pain and care about their offspring and communicate. But humans are unique in how we make stories and share them throughout space and time, all over the world and throughout history, to help us process what's happening in the world. But this investigation made it clear that as journalists, we also need to remember that stories can be used for social control and to control the public and to repress. Now, I go into that aspect, the repression aspect, in much detail in this investigation and in this new book. But in our conversation, I wanted to think about how we can use some of those same techniques of storytelling to improve our work as journalists. Because once we see how governments and powerful people can use storytelling to deceive the public, I think it's our responsibility as journalists to understand how we can use storytelling to share the truth and to educate. I really love this sentiment from Susan Sontag, the American writer and essayist. And she says that storytelling is an activity that faces in two directions. And what she's saying is that it can face in the direction of truth or lies. Or in terms of our writing and our film, we can face in the direction of journalism and documentary, or in the direction of misinformation, entertainment, or even propaganda. And I've long understood that, as I think you all do as a journalist. I mean, the reason you're in this program and that you're working in this craft is a commitment to face in the direction of truth and tell those truthful stories. But I think in doing that, journalists, we can also lose sight of the fact that those techniques are the same, whether people are telling a true story or um, a Hollywood film or a movie on Netflix. It's all the same techniques. And that's particularly important for us to understand right now because we're, I'll say, in a very interesting time for journalists. We are facing rapidly decreasing attention spans, increasing attacks on press freedom and our ability to do our work internationally. There are disinformation campaigns both by government and by corporations. As I understand that you all are increasingly confronting in Armenia with Russian propaganda, state-sponsored news. We're in an environment that this isn't just a threat from, Russia or state agencies like the United States, even, but also from third-party groups and propaganda campaigns that we're not sure quite where they are originating on social media. Finally, there's a rapid decline in public trust. I think that's tied to authoritarians attacking journalists publicly and saying we are, quote, the enemy of the people in the United States. But nevertheless, I think we're losing some trust of our consumers. And finally, I think, I don't know if this is the right term for this, but as I'm on book tour right now and speaking to people all over the world, it feels like we're all just exhausted by the severity and the darkness of it all. There are so many crises, from the genocide in Gaza to the environmental crisis, attacks on journalism, attacks on immigrants and migrants. Um, it's so much that I feel like people are kind of feeling a fatigue from that and not wanting to engage with really serious journalism and investigative reporting. So, in that spirit, I wanted to highlight what I think are a few um, tangible techniques that we can be thinking about in our work as journalists, so that I'm not just here talking about all these negative things and these attacks. I hope you can walk away with this with some techniques that are positive you can bring into your work. And these are all techniques I've drawn from fiction, from novels, from Hollywood films that we can apply in our work as well. We often don't think this way as journalists, but our stories are fundamentally about character. They're about people. Um, I would encourage you all to try to think of any great story from um, a book to a film or just a story you've heard from a friend. Imagine telling that story without the people involved. And this might sound kind of silly, but I think as journalists, we end up doing this quite a bit because we're telling stories about government agencies and regulations and new laws. And it's easy to lose the people who are in that story. And those people are what bring the story to life. We have to think about, just as a fiction writer does, what is motivating them, from the elected official to the protester on the street. How do we put them in their element? In other words, if you're writing about someone, don't just try to meet the scientists in their office at the university. Try to go into their laboratory, go out with them on their experiment. And the more you can create those scenes for your reader or for your audience, it's going to bring that to life. Now, of course, we have to be mindful of using characters in a simplistic way, which I think we can fall victim to in journalism, of wanting to have a specific type of voice in our story. And then we use that, whether it's a migrant or someone of a certain social class or ethnicity or whatever, to kind of represent the whole. And we don't want to simplify in that way. We want characters that stand on their own, that are not being used in this kind of um, judgmental way. Second, one thing we always have of journalists, journalists in all of our stories, there's a tension. And we forget how important that tension is to keeping public interest in a story. As journalists, we often want to explain the tension in the very first paragraph of our story. And sometimes that's really important. But other times we can take our time a little bit to use that tension of what's going to happen, the energy, the movement, conflict, desire or lack of desire, um, to build up audience interest. Now, when I say tension, to be clear, I'm not talking about being sensational or just having controversy. We see this obviously a lot on the internet right now of um, podcasters and YouTube influencers creating controversy as a way to get our interest. As journalists, we have to be much more restrained and think about the natural tension in the story. A way I think about this in long form reporting, for instance, in my books or in magazine articles, you can create tension in your narrative by pace and interrupting the story. So for instance, in my book, I am telling a story of me investigating these industrial farms, but then I take breaks from that at key moments, such as when I was being chased by farmers to get me to stop taking photographs. I end that moment there and then pull back and talk about the law, talk about more big picture um, issues, kind of more in depth analysis. And what I've heard from people is that allows them to continue being interested. You know, they want to keep reading through all of that more dense or complicated material to get back to the story that we left off. There's so much we could say about how we structure our news reports as journalists. And I actually should have asked in our Armenian journalists, are you familiar with this concept of the inverted pyramid? Is that being taught in kind of a little bit? So what that goes back in American journalism well over 100 years, when the technology was much different. And so to edit our stories, we put all of the most important information in the very first paragraph, right? The who, what, when, where, why, everything that happened. Because if the story got cut off, the reader is getting the most important parts. We're not in that environment anymore. We don't have a shortage of paper or ink. Most of us are publishing online also. We have space. So we can think about other structures that are better for storytelling. Joseph Mitchell will talk about this idea of the hero's journey. That if you think about something like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or famous dramas. They're about the journey that the main character takes. I would argue we can think that way about our stories as well, the people that we're writing about. In some ways, I think we need to think about structure like we think about if you have a sick child who doesn't want to take their medicine. And I don't want to be insulting to our readers, but that's how I feel much of the time. I write about really heavy things that I think the public needs to understand, but there's so many other temptations that are more entertaining. So by using storytelling techniques, we can talk about those issues that the public needs in a way that maybe they want to read about as well. When we think about our tone and our voice as journalists, it's quite a bit different than a fiction writer. Um, if you think about a good novel, that voice of the author allows for so much creativity and experimentation. As journalists, I think if we experiment too much with our voice, it can start making our work feel too much like fiction. It feels too experimental. I think our voice is naturally more reserved, more restrained. It can either be that uh, your author's voice to establish connection, but it could also, if we use it too much, distract from the voice of our sources, right? Ultimately, we want the voices of the people that we're interviewing to be dominant in our story, not our personal technique. And this is kind of silly, but this is what I remind my journalism students all the time. When we think about tone, we just need it to be consistent and trustworthy and predictable. So if I were to tell you, hey, we're going to go out for beer and pizza, you immediately know maybe the kind of bar or the kind of restaurant we're going to. It's very different than thinking about having strawberries and champagne, right? Both of them are great, but you don't want to start really mixing the two. I don't know, maybe beer and champagne would be quite good, but I think for the purposes of storytelling, we want that consistent feel. So if you pick a very conversational, um, friendly, you know, tone like beer and pizza, stick with it. If your tone for your media outlet is a little bit more elevated, more professional, perhaps more academic, you need to stick in that mode as well. Now, we know how important dialogue is if we go to a film or if we're reading a novel, but I think journalists, we often forget that we have so much of that at our disposal as well. We're talking to fascinating people every day. So as we use their direct quotes and their dialogue in our reporting, I would like us to think about it not just as a way of showing proof that we talked to this person, but how is it moving that story forward? Who is speaking? How often do we hear from them? What are the sources that we're hearing from first and giving priority? And by the same account, what are the voices that are missing from a piece? I think these are some of the questions that we often don't ask when we're, especially if some of you are daily reporters, right? We have to file stories so quickly. We don't get to think in that way. Now, to kind of bring all of this to life a little bit, I know that's somewhat abstract talking about these techniques. Here's how this affected me in my recent book. This is a woman named Helen Redout. She lives in Washington State. And when I was doing those drone investigations, I had some technical difficulties and I lost a drone. And I thought that I was really freaking out. This was a lot of money. It was dangerous. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't believe I messed up and I somehow lost this technology that I really need in an expensive camera. Um, One of my sources connected me to this woman, Helen. And Helen was a reminder to me and really a turning point of thinking about storytelling. Now, at that time, remember, I was doing those drone investigations to get around censorship laws, to tell the story despite government attacks on journalism. And I think I had lost sight of the fact that, that's a compelling news article. It made for some good photographs, but we need to have the people that are affected. And so when I met with Helen, we spent several days of her just taking me around her community. And in some ways, I think it was the most powerful chapter in the book because she is telling me how much, in her words, her community has changed. She can't open her windows because of the pollution. She can't breathe the air. This is her country home with her husband, and she's seen the community go from something beautiful to something where she can't even go outside. And when we're thinking about storytelling, I realize that I can put all of the government facts in scientific research. I can describe how bad this pollution is. I can take the photographs, but it's not until we start communicating that in a story that resonates with our public that it really comes to life. Um, and I know that this is not something we always have access to as journalists. With our deadlines and our pressures, we don't always have time to think in this more narrative way, um, especially as we're chasing breaking news or something that we got assigned to at the last minute. But I've really come to believe in this era of attention span shrinking and misinformation and censorship that the more we can use the power of storytelling to connect to our readers, the more effective we can be at challenging the false stories that are being told today. Um, it's not enough just to say that the government is lying or that an elected official was caught in a scandal, or a corporation is in a lawsuit. I think we're starting to lose sight of the meaning behind those narratives and how we as journalists can use these techniques to be more engaged and relevant in our work. So I know that I've dumped a lot of information on you all, both about my own work and about how we can think in this way through storytelling. But I'm really looking forward to talking to you all in questions and comments as you're thinking through this as well. So, in that spirit, thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to talk.
I'll start with the first question, keeping it to storytelling. I was really happy to hear you talk about that. My students are probably sick of me saying the same things you were about the importance of storytelling and how we make sense of reality with it. And the big agriculture and the industries, they have very powerful stories as well, obviously, and obviously the means to disseminate those stories. One of which is that little red barn imagery. And also, you talk about in your book how we've been disengaged from agriculture for most of the 20th century for various economic and societal reasons. So it seems it's very easy we want to kind of fool ourselves, I think, with this kind of little red barn fantasy, right? So it plays into how we want to ignore some of the abuses that happen with factory agriculture, factory farming. How do we counter that as a journalist when there's a very powerful narrative already that kind of plays into our desire to not deal with ugly truths?
That's a great question. And more specifically, there's been an enormous amount of research that humans have a very strong confirmation bias, which is what Sean's describing. We want to believe what we think we already know. We want to believe things that fit with what we've been raised to believe and what our friends believe and what just kind of intuitively makes sense to us. And we really have to remember that, especially in investigative journalism. In this investigation, I came face to face with that reality because my big breakthrough in this work was realizing that because we're raised with the story of that little red barn, and if you think about it, we see that we're taught that story before we can even speak, both with the toys, the songs, children's books. Kids love the happy little animals, right? We learn that narrative before we learn about um, country or religion or what it means to be a man, any of these other cultural stories that we have, right? And the reason that's so dangerous is because when we've been taught that story our entire life, our confirmation bias is so strong that all the industry needs to do is use some of those images to invoke the story that we've been taught. And we just, immediately trust it. And so this investigation taught me, though, that I think as journalists, we confront that in a lot of different areas. I mean, it's very open, and we can see it with that little red barn image. But if you're reporting on, parliament or elected officials or going to a press conference, they're all using similar techniques to try to um, resonate and get us to identify with what we think we already know. To answer your question, and it's a difficult one of how we combat that, I think it's a couple of things. Um, we have to establish enough trust with our audience that we can tell them that they're being lied to, that we can point out and ask tough questions about those stories and say, hey, we know that you've been receiving all of this image, but it's our personal and professional responsibility to go beyond the story and to actually look at the substance of the facts. And the more we can establish, or I should say, reestablish that relationship with our readers, the better we're going to be able to break through some of these narratives. Um, to me, this is what drew me to journalism as a teenager. I think humans, we want to believe the stories we're taught, but we also have a real deep desire to wonder what else is happening, to see beyond the narratives that we're being told. And I think if we embrace that as journalists, this is how we break through some of those false narratives.
Thank you so much for this
Yes.
interesting presentation. Honestly, I have a practical question as a journalist. So I think
Sure.
when we've studied a lot, and you said that too, that finding a hero to have the real human story is really important. And I think that's what we often struggle with, because it's really hard to find that person. So my question is, in your practice, how do you find the person, and how do you make this connection so that they trust you enough to share really what they think?
I think there are a couple of pieces of it. First, I'll say, to make a small distinction, when we're trying to identify that hero's journey, that person themselves doesn't need to be a hero. And I say that because we can tell powerful stories as journalists about people who are, frankly, as we all are, very flawed and have made poor decisions, right? So the person that we're writing about doesn't need to necessarily be a hero, but the journey that they're on, their struggles, their challenges, the way we're telling their story is how I think we need to think of that hero's journey. And more specifically to your question of how we identify them, a few things come to mind. Um, One is that I think there's an increasing pressure right now for journalists to do more and more stories with less time. And the reality is that this type of reporting takes a little bit more time because we have to get out of the newsroom, away from our desk, and meeting people face to face. And that's something that I don't know how it is in Armenia, but that's increasingly difficult in the US because we're just stuck at our desk making phone calls, emails, reporting that way. And I think as much as possible, if we can get into the field, even for a few hours, even just meeting a source in person rather than over the phone, can help you get a better idea of their character and can establish that trust more easily. It is very difficult to establish trust electronically. I mean, just think about sending text messages, even to your husband or wife or, partner, how easy it is to miscommunicate. I think when we're establishing trust, especially with vulnerable populations, we have to be there in person as much as possible. The other things we can do are recognize that it's not something you can do immediately. So when I'm meeting with people who work on these industrial farms, or I'm meeting with former FBI agents, that trust and that interview doesn't happen on the first meeting. And this is something I learned primarily from investigative journalism, that the actual interview might not happen until you've already had a dozen other conversations, right? All of those other conversations are about establishing trust. It might mean that over the course of several months, you're just checking in. I'll take Helen as an example, who lived in the farm community. I was able to establish trust because I was introduced to her through someone else that she really trusted and who knew my work. So I had this third party vouch for me and validate me. So that's a really important technique. I was there in person. We spent a lot of time together. That helped develop our trust. I was authentic. I was just myself. Um, I didn't pretend to be objective. Like as I was seeing her community, I was very affected by it. I told her I'm motivated to do this work because I feel like this is unfair and I want to tell the story. And so I know, not to say then my final reporting is going to abandon that objectivity, but I think it's okay to be ourselves and to be vulnerable with our sources. Um, and finally, I think this is also something that's trust is established over entire careers. It's something that I think often in relationships, we see this as well. In friendships, trust is very slow to establish and it's very easy to lose, right? And I think that's what we have to be careful for as journalists. Trust takes a very long time to develop. It is very difficult to reestablish after it's been lost. So take your time, find other people that these sources trust, show up, reach out to them, care for them as an individual. And I think those are some of the foundational elements to get that trust.
Thank you for this very insightful touch points on storytelling, and my questions goes to that. The one distinction I see between storytelling and journalism and journalism is the ending. Actually, you have work dedicated 10 years on investigating this farming story. So this is the story you've picked, as there are a lot of stories and we should pick one. And it seems you have made a choice in this case. But when it comes to journalism, I think we are dealing with stories that have no ending. If the deadline is not the ending, let's say, one may say it's the ending, but for me it seems that are stories that we never finish. And I want to ask how you feel with that sense. Is it okay for you that the stories are felt unfinished, or have you found any, like, say, ending for yourself when you will think that your story is finished? Thank you.
Oh, that's such a good question, and that really resonates with me after such a long project, as you might imagine. I really struggled with that because we don't very often as journalists reach some nice resolution. There's not a natural ending. Uh, really, these stories are always, I agree with you, they are never ending in the sense that as journalists, we're wanting to keep the public updated and on the cutting edge of what's happening. So by nature, our work never ends. I've struggled with that with my first book too. I was documenting how environmental protesters were being labeled as terrorists by the US government. And I followed a group of people that eventually went to prison. When it was time to publish the book, some of the people were still in prison. These issues hadn't been resolved. There were all kinds of questions that I had remaining. And I started to feel a lot of doubt. And frankly, just extreme doubt of like, can I can I present this as a complete story when, as you said, it's just continuing? The way I've processed this after working with a lot of colleagues, and I think we're all struggling with this, is to think of it as this doesn't have to be the definitive story. This is not the last story ever written on whatever topic you're dealing with. And the more we can remind ourselves of that, it can take some pressure off of ourselves. I often try to remind myself as well that it's kind of like I'm a print journalist, but if you work with a camera or do documentary, think of doing it's a snapshot, right? You don't have you might have a wide angle lens, but there's so much you can get in the frame of your story. And that's just the limitation of the craft. So my goal as a journalist is to give the best possible, most factual, most accurate, most critical version of the story that I can, given those limitations. Um, s Practically speaking, some of the ways that we might do this in our actual story, I think there are times where it's appropriate to acknowledge directly to your readers the questions that are still not answered. Um, to make that very clear, I think it's good for either you or your sources to acknowledge what we don't know, especially if you're writing about science or technology or even government policy. I think the more we can be open about the questions we still have, the better. Another way of thinking about it is the more we focus on those kind of individual narratives, what we're trying to do is have a cohesive story in that sense, but not for the big picture issue, if that makes sense. So I'm not trying to write the definitive, cohesive story of food because that's too big, or even of animal agriculture, that's too big. I'm trying to tell this story through my eyes of what I documented in this 10-year period to the best I can. And so it's imperfect. And I think we have to accept that it's imperfect.
I have a quick question. So, like, how do you stay motivated to chase a story for 10 years? Like, what drives you to not to give up? You know what I mean? Because, again, like you mentioned, attention spans are short, things are moving so quickly. Like, what drives you to kind of stick and follow that story?
I always tell my journalism students, you have to write the type of story that feels like it will just burn you up in your chest if you don't. We don't always get to do that as journalists. We often have to write the story that our editors assign. But if you find a story like that, that just really resonates that deeply, um, you have to become obsessive about it. And to be very honest, there were many points I almost quit. I mean, but I talk about in the book at one point, as I was a professor, I was also in school at night to be a motorcycle mechanic because I'm just like, I don't know how to resolve this project. It feels like journalism is under attack. People don't care. Why am I doing this horrible stuff? Um, and of course, I couldn't do that. I kept coming back to this work and to journalism because I believe we're trying to do something bigger. I mean, we're trying to provide a service to the public, and I think um, we have to remind ourselves that we don't often know the impact of our work when we put it out in the world. Um, the one thing I've seen after doing this work for so many years now, this has been my entire life. You publish a story and you have no idea if anyone cares, um, if it makes any difference at all. And then as time goes on, you're going to hear from people that saw that story years ago and that affected them. I've met students who read my work from 20 years ago and are now lawyers or now investigative journalists themselves. And if I can have some small role in inspiring or to give other people a bit of that motivation, that's what I really draw from. Um, and because frankly, it's a dark time in the US. Like I never thought we would be at the point we are now. Our democracy is truly at risk. of disappearing. The attacks on journalism we're seeing today, it's very difficult to keep working in a profession that the jobs aren't really there. They don't pay well. You work really long hours and you're not respected often from the government or from corporations. And I say that directly to you all. You all know the difficulties here, but you're there in that room anyway. You're in that program anyway at the university. And we have to keep sight of that. Like, despite all of these difficulties, I think journalism is a craft where we get to learn something new every day. We get to meaningfully shape what's happening in the world in profound ways. And we get to have, the most amazing encounters with people like Helen that I never would have met otherwise. So for me personally, that's what I draw from. Thinking about like others who have been positively influenced, and also, that this is in many ways, it's a privilege to do this work, and to feel like we have a purpose to contribute right now.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was very, very interesting, especially how you connected creative writing with techniques with journalism. I did want to ask one question. Would it be possible to consider this technique formulaic in terms of looking at narratives of the public and trying to rewrite them? Could we approach that as like a formula, or is it something that can only be applied in specific cases, like the red barns?
I think it's a little bit of both. I'm hesitant here because I think we need to watch out for our own storytelling becoming formulaic, right? Like, I think that's a risk that as writers and storytellers, it's easy to fall into predictable patterns of how our stories should be told. And that's dangerous because it both can become less interesting and less engaging to the public. And also, it becomes simplistic. And I think we have to question ourselves and not just say, oh, this is this is the hero of the story challenging the big corporation. I could have written that story 1,000 times in my life, but I want to be careful of not misrepresenting what's going on. So I'll say that. But in terms of how we can apply it to other, this type of thinking to other types of issues besides the Little Red Barn, absolutely. One thing that really stuck with me about this investigation is not just how I came to see the story we tell of food, but that's very similar to these other massive stories that we tell about what it means to be a human being that we often don't think about. In the book, I talk about there's a field of research that's describing stories that are so large we never actually see them. I would argue the Little Red Barn is one of those, but the story of nationalism, right? Of what it means to be a country, what it means to have a national identity, what a religion means, what it means to be a man or a woman, what it means to be of a certain class, what capitalism means. These are all stories that are so big that we never really have a space to question them or even see them as a story. And the more as journalists we can see those meta stories, those master narratives, the better I think we can do our job of breaking apart the components of that, if that makes sense. So in other words, if what's a good example? As I'm seeing President Trump attack the new mayor of New York City, Zoran Mamdani, there was a story in the press for a while about how he's going to send in the troops. He calls them a communist. This is setting up like, frankly, potential civil war types of dynamics in the United States. And then he met President Trump in the White House, and the meeting was not at all what anybody expected. And so I think we need to, in a situation like that, as we're watching those press conferences, step back and see these bigger stories. For instance, in the United States, we've had 100 years of anti-communist government propaganda. And then in practice, when people like that meet, a lot of that narrative suddenly disappears. So I hope that's making sense, or I hope I'm understanding your question correctly. Of both, we need to see how it's employed individually, but also see those really big stories that we often don't get to question.
Building off that question and related to the storytelling aspect, so in Little Red Barns, you mentioned that you pulled back quite a bit from talking about some of the abuses that you saw, right? Because they're very graphic. You mentioned some of those just kind of, fairly briefly. But one of the sentences that really struck out to me is when you just mentioned, I think it was saying how you saw mother pigs, trying to rescue their babies and things like that. Didn't even have the statistics to it. It was just that almost kind of a humanizing kind of aspect, right? So, do you see power in that, or are there dangers with that kind of anthropomorphizing the, say, animal situations, that it might select certain kinds of animals that we want to protect more than others, or it might make the story more shallow, that kind of thing?
I struggled with that with the book, and we went back and forth with my publisher and editors quite a bit, thinking about that question, because I really didn't want this book to just be page after page of research, or page after page of all of the really horrific things that I saw. Um, my fear was that a reader wouldn't want to sit through all of that, that it would be too much. But then as a journalist, I felt a responsibility to document all of the things I've seen. And I felt really uncomfortable at first removing so much of that from my narrative, because it felt like my job as a journalist is to bear witness, it's to show what other people haven't seen. And so I guess my first response is that's a real tension of, I arrived at the point of thinking, I'm not going to hide any of this. I'm obviously going to tell that story. It has to be told. But in some ways, I came to believe the most effective way is not through the volume of material, but by being very careful in the details that I do share. Um, so, for instance, I describe scenes from the undercover video. I describe scenes that I personally experienced. And when I did do that, here's a technique I should probably add to this presentation for you all, is that the more emotional your material is, the more um, either really difficult or painful or violent or extreme, or as that gets higher, our language has to get more and more simple and direct, right? Does that make sense to everyone? So in other words, if we're describing a scene of horrific violence in war, our language, I would argue, should not have a bunch of adjectives. We should not be saying how horrible this is, how an abuse of justice, right? Our language should be very simple, to make sure that we're letting that scene speak for itself. In journalism, we say to show, don't tell. I would get even more specific and say that we should show with very clear declarative sentences, active verbs. So, Sean, to your point of the mother pigs and their piglets, it was, I saw this. I didn't want to go into details about how much that affected me. I didn't talk about how awful this is. It was just, I saw this. And I think as a journalist, that is what I'm supposed to do, to make a powerful statement of fact, and let the emotion of that statement be felt in the reader, but not in how I'm trying to influence the reader. But you have a great point about, when we write about animals, I think there's a lot of sensitivity to going too far, of trying to get the public to understand and be compassionate through us describing them as human beings. Um, and I was really careful of that throughout the book. I wanted this to be a book and an investigation that is for people who care deeply about animals, people who are vegetarian, that's great. My main focus of this book, I wanted to reach people who don't know anything about that, who don't see themselves as that way, but care about these issues because it affects all of us. And so to do that, I had to be very careful of how I'm telling this story and not let it get to turn into propaganda, not let it turn into something that's too heavy-handed with the audience.
Have a question, but I did have a comment, and I just wanted to. So I'm a faculty member here, and I am not a journalist, but I'm a writing teacher. I think I have a closet journalist inside of me, and I have had for a long time. But I've taught classes on food, like all aspects of food, and so I especially appreciate all of your work, and I wanted to tell you that I especially appreciate all the work that
Thank
you've
you.
done over the years, and like for your dedication to the craft and to pursuing such a difficult story in the US. For everything that has gone into that, I think it's so necessary to understand. And like you were talking about, it's the meta story. Like food is something that so many people ignore, or they think isn't really an issue, that has no real substance to it, but because it is so ubiquitous, because it's such a normal part of everybody's life. And so I just wanted to say thank you for all of your work, and dedication
Thank you
to
very much.
telling these stories, and also for the really careful way, your thoughtful way of presenting this information to us. I really, really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you so much for saying that. That's very kind of you. And I mean, frankly, what we were talking about previously, that means the world to me. I mean, and you have to appreciate moments like that and making connections with folks and all over the world doing the same type of work you are. I think that's how we keep going, especially when we're thinking about these just massive unseen issues, like you said. And I'll also try to encourage that closeted or secret journalist inside you, and say to the folks in the room, if you're interested more in the creative writing or fiction, memoir, film, thinking as a journalist will directly shape and improve your work as well. I think it goes both ways. I think we need to learn, as journalists, the storytelling techniques from the professionals who have pioneered this in fiction and novels. But also fiction writers, I think, could learn a lot from the research methodology and fact checking of our own work. So I appreciate you making those connections very much.
And of U.S. adults think that chocolate milk comes from brown cows. Was that in the book? I can't remember the percentage exactly, but
It was,
yeah,
believe it or not.
yeah. So that'll be real progress.
Yeah, that was a shocking part of this to me, is how little we know about food. Um, Connecting to the um, previous speaker's comment, I mean, we think of it as just this given, and it was only within a couple of generations that we've lost touch with what it means to raise our own food, to grow our own food. This is a very modern invention. I mean, even up until the 1940s and 50s, in my research in the US, most people had some connection with the production of their food. Either they were living close to a farm, they knew the farmer, they were involved in the community in some way. It's only in fairly recently that we've shifted into this industrial model where now whatever food we need, we just go to the grocery store. For most of us, right? If we have that privilege, and what it's allowed is this huge knowledge gap. Where, to Sean's point, yeah, there was actually research paid for by the dairy industry, of that many people thinking chocolate milk came from brown cows. Even worse than that, I've talked to nearly everyone I speak to, thinks that dairy cows just naturally produce milk. And I think it connects to this storytelling aspect. Those cows have to constantly have babies. They're making milk because they're mothers. And I know that sounds like a very self-evident thing to some of you, but we don't think about that. And those babies, the males in particular, don't have any value in the industry. So that's when they're shipped off to be veal. And they're kept in very small restraining devices to keep them supple and small. But it's that type of thing where it's so out of our daily life that we don't have to think about it. And I should say that's particularly dangerous here. We didn't talk about it in this presentation, but a big part of this investigation was the environmental impact of animal agriculture. This is one of the top contributors to climate change, to species loss and extinction, water pollution, air quality. I have asthma, and the asthma rates of being in farming communities are rapidly increasing. Um, so this censorship is a story not just about people like Helen or about the animal cruelty. These industries are also censoring the environmental data from journalists. They're rewriting the laws to keep it so to make it so we can't get that information. Um, so our distance from agriculture, I think, is allowing all of those that misinformation to take place.
Closing down of websites and things like that the government's doing. So a real issue in the States, as you mentioned. So, yeah. Well, I'd like to thank Will Potter once again for this really informative talk, and thank you very much. And it was really good for us. So.
Thank you all so much. I'm really grateful for the time. And like I said, I know I was in graduate school at night as a working journalist also. I know it's difficult. And so kudos to you all for staying the course and continuing this craft. I appreciate you all coming. If anyone has any questions or wants to reach out, my email is just my name. It's will@willpotter.com. And my website is just my name, willpotter.com. If I'm happy to help however I can. And hopefully one day I'll be over there to say hello to you all in person.